Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This week's video is going over my first personal attempt at nixtamalization, which you may or may not know is the both modern and ancient Mexican practice of par cooking corn, which transforms it into masa dough. What you already saw was us suspending calcium hydroxide into the water. It doesn't really dissolve very much, but the alkaline compound is critically important for the entire process. Now, my basic process and measurements are all based off an old blog post from chef, bartender, and podcast host Dave Arnold. This is from back when he was teaching at the French Culinary Institute in New York, and it's one of the most detailed English language sources on the process I could find. Because very little of the actual compound is dissolved at any one time, you can have a static ratio between the dried corn and the calcium hydroxide, which is about 1%, and then the exact ratio of water isn't critical, but we are shooting for roughly 3 times the quantity of water to corn. The exact chemistry happening is pretty complex, but there are several important things happening. One, the alkaline and the heat is helping partially dissolve the pericarp, which is the outermost coating of the corn kernel. You are also partially cooking and gelatinizing the starch, but you don't want to fully cook it because then you end up with pozole, and that doesn't turn into a good masa for making other items. And for this first experiment, I really wanted to try working with this blue popcorn. Now, in the blog post I reference, he specifically recommends not to use popcorn because there is a relatively high ratio of that seed coating versus the starchy interior of the kernel. But it looked really cool, and I was hoping the flavor would be better than standard dried field corn. And throughout this process, you need to be feeling and even tasting the corn kernels. On screen is the checklist that Dave Arnold has for when the process is complete. The process took a little over an hour, and I was worried that we maybe even overshot, so I ended up adding some ice cubes at the very end to accelerate cooling. We now jump ahead to the next day. The entire mixture just gets covered and sits at room temperature for at least 8 hours, but it makes most sense to just leave it overnight. We are draining away all of this cooking liquid, and then we are attempting to remove the pericarp slash seed coating. This is one of those reasons popcorn isn't ideal, but with a little more water and a little more force, we did remove a little bit of it. Again, for flavor and structure, you don't want to remove all of it. We also are hopefully not over rinsing the corn because you do also want some traces of that calcium left in the final mixture. But we can probably correct for this in the future by using a better suited corn. Now we start the all important grinding process, and we are beginning with a food processor and a little bit of added water. Now, in theory, if you work in small batches and add a pretty significant amount of water, you can actually process fresh nixtamalized corn with only a food processor. The issue there becomes having to correct the hydration of the masa with a decent amount of masa flour, which is obviously something you can buy and doesn't have as strong a flavor as fresh nixtamalized corn. It's also important to note that a very fine masa that is ideal for tortillas is the hardest to achieve, whereas a slightly chunkier masa is okay for tamales or certain other applications. Lucky for me, I am crazy enough to have a chocolate conch, which isn't exactly the right kind of equipment, but it's close enough to get the job done. A traditional Masa grinder also uses granite, but in a different form factor for grinding. But honestly, I am pretty happy with how it turned out. And then we just continue working through the rest of the corn, hopefully adding the right amount of water. I was calling out educated guesses on measurements of water to add, but my dad apparently just added random amounts. Once everything was done pre-grinding, it was just about observing and troubleshooting the conch. It was definitely struggling a little bit, but I think in the future with a smaller batch, it would work quite well. And then we made a final, again, random amount of water added to the mixture, but it did seem to help. Ultimately, though, I would say the conch did work. Again, definitely adjustments to make for the future, but it is certainly the best piece of equipment I have, and I think given that it's useful for many other projects, I think it's one of the best somewhat multitaskers that could do a good job with making masa. And even though the popcorn wasn't ideal, I mean, look at that color. I would say it was even a little more vibrant in person, almost a cool speckled robin egg blue. And it was pretty smooth. Apparently, after showing it to some people more familiar with making masa, it should have been even smoother, as in a completely uniform appearance. But again, I can adjust that for the future. And Off camera, we did a test that didn't quite work, so we adjusted the hydration with just 100 grams of masa harina, so really only a slight amount compared to the overall size of the batch. With that minor adjustment, the tortillas were pressing pretty nicely, and then it was just about getting used to the actual cooking parameters for the tortillas. So we continued to practice and we got some telltale bubbling, but not the extreme amount that you actually want for tortillas. I think that was less about the actual masa, and again, the pan just not being quite hot enough, or maybe a little bit of both. But overall, I would say this project was a massive attempt for a first attempt at a complex process. For the future, I'm definitely going to do smaller batches and use a more standard field corn for a few attempts. And once I get good, I will be ordering some heirloom Mexican corn from a US based retailer. It's just a slight investment. There is also some precedent for doing the actual nixtamalization process with a stock or other flavorful liquid instead of just plain water. So, of course, I immediately want to dive into that avenue of experimenting as well as using the masa in preparations that aren't standard. So I hope you enjoyed this project. Again, a little less practical for most people, but it's still a really interesting project. Although I do think anybody could replicate the first process and either just make pozole, which doesn't require any equipment for grinding. I also talked to somebody who had decent results with a good quality meat grinder for actually forming the masa. But if you have any questions or ideas, please let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoy looking at this sneak preview for next week's video, which is what we ended up serving with the fresh tortillas.